Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. My guest today on Podcast for Inquiry is Dr. Gale Sinatra. Gale is a distinguished professor of psychology and education at the Rossier School of Education at the University of Southern California and a member of the National Academy of Education. Gale heads the Motivated Change Research Lab at USC, the mission of which is understanding the cognitive, motivational, and emotional processes that lead to attitude change, conceptual change, and successful STEM learning. Gale is the author of Science Denial, Why It Happens and What to Do About It. And we talk about some of the cognitive flaws that all of us have that lead to science doubt and science denial. And the 4 out of the many that are in the book that we talk about today are cognitive biases, emotions, motivated reasoning, and identities. We then move on to how all of us can improve our abilities to understand some of the complexities of the universe and have a deeper understanding of science. And the first is to understand science as a process and not merely a collection of facts to be understood. And we also delve into the 3 types of mindset that people can have about the world around us, and how, as we can move from an absolutist view of the world to more of an evaluativist view, how that leads to more nuance and therefore more accuracy. I'm very proud to bring you my conversation with Dr. Gale Sinatra. Gale Sinatra, thank you for speaking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
I want to talk to you today because you wrote a book that I've read and have found very interesting, and it's called Science Denial. So I'm trying to find a way to put it on the screen without the glare, but Science Denial, what it is, why it happens, and what to do about it. And I'll confess, I have a particular bias. I'm an activist, and I want to get things done. And I think everybody, in whatever they want to change things for the better. And from my perspective, if you want to change things, you have to understand the world as it is and how things will react when you make a change so that you can get the result that you want. And for that, in my view, requires at least a basic scientific literacy. Understanding the world as it is the body of knowledge that we call science. Understanding how it will react is kind of the process of making scientific predictions, which are sometimes right and sometimes way off the mark. But even if people want to achieve different things than I do, people want to achieve things with their lives. And I would think that a basic fundamental understanding of the world and the universe we inhabit would be a necessary starting point. But that turns out not to be the case. So my first question to you is really right there in your subtitle. Why is it that science denial happens at all? Am I rare in my perspective, or what's going on? Because it is, before reading your book, somewhat mysterious to me.
Well, that's a great question. I want to start with your premise. You mentioned that sort of you were talking about the utility of science, and I do want to start there and say that some people think that science is just for scientists, and science education is just for people who are going into STEM careers. But as you were saying in your question, science is for everyone, and science has a utility for us in our everyday lives. We can use it to make decisions, we can use it to solve problems, and those are not just scientific problems, but just everyday problems. The idea that we can reason and think from evidence and make predictions and draw conclusions, those are all incredibly useful skills. So I do want to highlight that you mentioned that importance of science for everybody, and I really believe in that. So you asked, like, why does it happen? Well, in our book, and I want to call out my co-author, Barbara Hofer of Middlebury College in Vermont, we discuss a number of different psychological constructs and how they impact our ability to think about science and sometimes to doubt, resist, and deny science. So there's a variety of them. We can discuss many of them, but we have some cognitive biases, which
Hmm.
lead us to have challenges with understanding science. We have emotions, which can either facilitate or inhibit our understanding of science. We have motivated reasoning, which sometimes leads us to more of a desired conclusion rather than an evidence based accurate conclusion. And we have identities, and sometimes we are more likely to believe what our identity group believes rather than evidence shows us. So, those are some of the things that we talk about in the book that give all of us potential struggles to understand and accept science.
All right, I would love to go through all of those and more, but I think the one that I would like to start with is emotions, because this is a topic that I've had with many people. And if in science fiction it goes all the way back to like Kirk versus Spock in Star Trek. And a lot of people in STEM like strive to be more Spock like, or like Sheldon in Big Bang Theory, to take a more contemporary pop culture example. But even putting aside pop culture references, there does tend to be a tendency, at least in some of the communities that I associate with, to push down or deny or to eliminate emotion from any consideration. And I mean, I certainly want to use logic. I don't want to. I'm not. I don't endorse making decisions based on how you feel about something. I think that will more likely than not lead you astray. I'm not really endorsing even intuitive or gut feel for making decisions, but using logic and reason and facts as a tool. But to my mind, emotions are essential because they help you prioritize, right? Science can't tell you what the right thing to do is, but if you know what the right thing to do is, then science can help you do it. So I'd like you to talk about how emotions can facilitate, and in some people, and inhibit in others, their understanding of the universe we live in, or to say that in a single word, science.
Well, it was long thought that this mythology of Spock or Sheldon, that scientists were, emotionless and objective creatures who somehow were able to put their emotions to the side in a box and then evaluate evidence objectively. Well, that's just not true. So, the way that emotions work is they are not separate from our cognition, as long ago thought, but rather integrated with our cognition. So, Mary Helen Imordino Yang, who happens to be my colleague here at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, she has been one of the preeminent emotion neuroscientists who've explained that we think through and with our emotions. They are not separate. So the first thing is we can't separate them, and we really don't want to separate them anyway, because it helps us to think through and with our emotions. So the idea is to understand that, understand the role of emotions, and let them integrate with your thinking. So we shouldn't, eschew them. But if you do get really, really mad or really, really upset or really, really excited about a particular scientific finding, you should take a step back and let yourself process that and think through and with your emotions. Why am I super angry about this? Or why am I super excited about this? maybe those emotions are driving your reasoning at that moment, and you want to work with your emotions and not have your emotions overcome the logical reasoning. They work together and they can work together well. The most important thing is to step back, to recognize that, ask yourself, why am I feeling this particular way? Are my feelings helping me, as you mentioned, to make a sound, good decision? Or are my feelings somehow overcoming my ability to think rationally? And if you have that awareness, your emotions can be much more helpful than harmful in your thinking and reasoning about science.
So you write in your book, I'm just going to quote one line from it. The new view of human cognition has gone from "I think, therefore I am," which is a very famous quotation from Rene Descartes, to "I feel, therefore I learn." And I find I found that a very provocative statement. I'm interested in it. Please tell me more about this proposition. I feel, therefore I learn. And we've kind of started on that, but I want to go deeper down that road.
Yeah, and I would credit Mary Helen Immordino Yang, the psychologist I just mentioned, neuroscientist, for helping us clarify what that means. It was long ago thought that they were completely separate processes, but she's shown that our ability to feel is how we process information, and we can leverage that. We can leverage empathy, for example, to think carefully about what we should do about poverty, as an example. So you can leverage your emotions to think, and you do leverage your emotions to think. And the trick is to do it in a productive and positive way rather than to do it in a way that eschews logic and reasoning. They're integrated and we shouldn't separate them. We can't separate them. And what she finds in her research is that when we leverage our emotions and work with them, they facilitate learning. And that is basically how we are human. So we must think through that. And as we leverage our emotions, we can make better decisions and we can think more rationally, in a sense, through and with our emotions.
Okay. Uh, but yet we are all very imperfect thinkers. I was on Wikipedia, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, and there's an article there, the list of cognitive fallacies, and I didn't actually count them all, but just eyeballing it, I think there were like 150 to 200 listed in that article, most of which had a link to a full article about what that cognitive bias or fallacy was. And really, I'm not a student of psychology or of neurology. I know, I'm definitely an outsider of the field. I've read a couple of books on the topics, but if if you believe in miracles, which I tend not to, the first miracle is that our brains work at all, given the number of kludges and failings and things we don't actually see that we think we see in the interpolations. And like, there are so many ways in which our brains can and do go wrong. If there's a miracle, it's that they ever get it right, or rather that they get it right so often. Now, you mentioned that cognitive biases are a major reason why there is so much science denial in the world. And I mean, I'm not immune to any of them myself. I work hard to overcome them. I'd like to think that I'm reasonably successful most of the time. Some people might want to challenge that, but can you talk about what the most prevalent cognitive biases are in people in general that lead to science denial?
Well, first, I want to talk about your comment about it's amazing our brains work at all. I think we need to remember what our brains were evolved for. Our brains were evolved to help us survive, and they were evolved in a different environment than in which we live now. And I
Right.
think that's so
Essentially, the African savannah is very different than
Didn't
urban
have
Canada
Twitter.
or the United States,
It
right?
didn't have Twitter.
Yeah.
It didn't have science as we know it now. So it was evolved. Our brains evolved in a very, very different environment and for a different purpose than to be scientific reasoners. That our brains evolved to help us survive.
But
To
isn't that a sense of, in a sense, a very like a scientific way? Like we can see as well as we can see, we can hear as well as we can hear, so that we can find food, find evade predators. That's a being able to figure out the tracks of, let's say, a herd animal, so that we can find, so that we where they were, evidence of where they were, to discover where they are now. Isn't that a scientific approach to finding prey, and inferring from a rustle in the grass whether it's the wind or whether it's a
absolutely,
lion?
absolutely.
That's
So our scientific reasoning skills are built on the top of, and that's literal because the lower brain evolved first. So our scientific reasoning skills are built on top of those skills. And so those early skills, of course, afford us the ability to think and reason. For example, causal reasoning. So, as you're just saying, causal reasoning is one of those really basic types of reasoning that kept people alive, right? If A then B, right? If you you saw someone in your tribe eaten by a particular animal, then you want to avoid that animal. So causal reasoning is a very important aspect of scientific reasoning. It's built on the backs of how our brains evolved. So that's all true, but we didn't evolve to hypothesis test with controlled experiments. We didn't evolve to do that. So we have learned to do that over time. And so some of the ways we think and reason have to be co opted to think scientifically, and it's not necessarily our default mechanisms. So, an example are these cognitive biases that you mentioned. There are hundreds of them. There is a recent article, and I'm blanking on the name, that does distill them down into a few different ones that you could really categorize. And I'm sorry to say I can't remember all of them now. But I can give you some examples. We tend to be biased to believe things that sound right to us, that we already have some sort of reason to believe is true. So that's one of our cognitive biases. One of our cognitive biases is the availability heuristic. So if we're hearing something a lot, we tend to think that it's more common than it is, or true, even if it is not. So there's a variety of these, and what you see of most of them is they are less reflective ways that we react to our environment. So you really have to talk now about what psychologists call system one and system two thinking. So you've
not
probably heard,
very imaginative, these psychologists, are they?
not really
But
brilliant.
okay, I mean, all right, that's the name. But system one, system two, that it doesn't really give, the names don't give us much insight into what they mean.
Well, you may have heard of the book Thinking Fast and Slow.
Daniel Kahneman wrote a book with
Kahneman,
that
right.
title.
So one of the only psychologists to win the Nobel for his very simple term, but very important insight. And that is, we have two modes of thinking. One is what's easily thought of as sort of knee-jerk reactions, right? Reactions that are not reflective. All of these cognitive biases really are those, right? They're sort of our knee-jerk reactions that um, served a purpose, back to our other conversation, in a prior way of living.
Hmm.
And the more reflective, evaluative part of our brain takes a second to kick in and can be willfully evoked. And that's what we have to do to overcome these cognitive biases.
So
We have to
which one
stop.
is system one and which one is system two?
System one is considered that basic knee jerk,
Okay.
quick automatic reaction. System two is considered the reflective, evaluative part of our cognitive system. So the trick in science is to recognize that you have these two systems and to give yourself a beat. Take a beat, give yourself a beat, and think about your reaction to some scientific information and let system two thinking kick in. It takes a beat, it takes a second, and you can be willful about it. You can't really be willful about system one. It sort of just does its thing because it's built on
Hmm.
this basic survival mechanisms we're talking about in human evolution. So you can't really stop it. What you can do is you can reflect on it and take a beat. A very basic example today would be like you're on social media, you read something and you immediately share it. Instead of that, you should stop and think, does this make sense? Is this really justified? Who's sharing this? Who's the source? All of those questions you might ask take a minute. They take a minute.
Right. Yeah, one of the things that frustrates me about so much of what I see on social media is that in addition to the blatant lies, there are things that are just taken completely out of context, like where you see, like one person. I'll just make up an example, but where things are so selectively edited or deceptively described, like you know, person A hit person B. This is a terrible thing, and what you don't see is that person B just hit person A 5 times immediately beforehand, or this decorated Navy SEAL has been persecuted by the police for standing up for our country when in fact the guy committed a crime that had nothing to do with his military record, right? But all you hear is like decorated military veteran persecuted, and like, oh, that's terrible. We should be proud of what they do, but the descriptions leave out the fact that he was arrested for a crime that presumably actually committed, or they had reasonable cause to think that he committed. But it can be, but in order to overcome that, you need more information. Like, it's not even just evaluating what you see. It's it's having more information, like what else happened that you didn't see, that someone deliberately did not include. So everything that you do see leads you to a particular conclusion that if you had the additional information that was not deceptively held back from you, you probably would reach a different conclusion. But that's hard. Like, it's one thing if someone lies to you and you can just say the whole thing is fake, but it's harder, I think, when you know okay, it's true as far as it goes, but the more important thing to know is something else. And how do you, I don't know, I think those are very different. How do you distinguish between the blatant lies and the deceptive truths?
Well, what we're doing right now is I have a grant, an NSF grant, National Science Foundation in the US, with Doug Lombardi from the University of Maryland and colleagues. And what this research team is doing is helping teachers teach kids how to evaluate scientific information online. And some of those strategies that we are teaching the students, that their teachers are teaching their students, are just exactly what we're talking about right now. It's stop when you read something online, and we're teaching a strategy developed by Sarah McGrew and Sam Weinberg from Stanford. Sarah's now at Maryland. They developed a technique called lateral reading. So, as you mentioned, it takes some work. It's not easy, but what you do instead of going down a page of information on the internet that's just going to give you algorithmically the most popular, but not necessarily the most accurate answers, If you
Hmm.
read something online and, like you say, you're not sure about it, so you open up a different window. That's the lateral part. And you move to a different window and you start to look, who's the source? You start to Google, who's the source of this information? Are other people saying this information who are reliable sources of information? So we've got an entire strategy that Sam has described. He might be an interesting person for you to interview in another podcast. He's just written a book called Verified, which is um, a description of how to evaluate mis and disinformation online. And we took this particular strategy, lateral reading, and we're teaching it to teachers to teach their kids. So these strategies, as you mentioned, do take work. They do take a little bit of time. We have found that you can employ these strategies in a couple of minutes. It doesn't take an hour, but it does take some training to know how to do it. And it does take this evoking system too. It does take this reflection and it does take this ability to stop and think. And all of those strategies can be taught. We are teaching them. They have been successfully taught to students as young as middle school, probably could be even taught in upper elementary. So this is something kids can learn. This is something adults can learn. It is hard to learn at first, but very quickly you can become facile at it. And so it's something that we can all learn to do.
All right. There's one key thing in what you just said that I want to focus in on, and that is you said that we should go to reliable sources of information. And I mean, all sources of it. I mean, it would be great if we had a ground truth, right? Whatever, like the Bible, right? An edict from on high that we could just say we can accept this. We don't need to question. But I mean, I don't know if you have something like that in your life. I don't, and I think many of our listeners, like everything is subject to question because human society, humans are fallible, and therefore anything humans create can be wrong. You wrote a scenario in your book that I think gets to the heart of this. I'm just going to quote a couple of lines. Um, you're talking about a woman who was having difficulty evaluating what she reads online, wondering how her doctor could be so sure. This is about vaccinations, how her doctor could be so sure in the face of such persuasive testimony against vaccinating, and unclear how some of her friends that she most respects can be confident about their alternative choices regarding vaccination. How does she decide? Where does she place her trust? Right? I choose my friends carefully. I, you know, have the doctor that I could get. And I generally trust the medical profession, but there are often debates among doctors, and even on the topic of vaccinations, you can find MDs who are against it, even though the overwhelming majority and the consensus is very much in favor of vaccinations. I don't want to talk about vaccinations per se. I certainly have a strong opinion, and people can listen to previous episodes of Podcast for Inquiry to get to that. But you need to place your trust in a particular source because I'm not an epidemiologist. I am not going to become one. I'm not an expert in almost every field of human endeavor. I have to trust somebody, and if I hear conflicting views, I need to evaluate. I am capable of evaluating whether their arguments are internally consistent. If they contradict themselves, fine, they can fall apart, and I can evaluate that. But whether they are true, whether those arguments are a true reflection of reality, I'm simply not qualified. So I need to trust somebody, or some source, some individual or some institution or a report or a study, a paper, uh, for what I'm going to believe to be true, and I could be wrong. And it's particularly dangerous if I place my trust in the wrong source. So you mentioned it in our conversation. You write about it in a book. Please help me and our listeners uh, educate us on how we can intelligently place our trust in the right sources.
Well, my nephew's an infectious disease doctor, and he likes to say, sure, you can do your own research. Just go to med school for 4 years, like I did, then do 2 years of postdoc, like I did, on infectious disease, and then you can do your own research. Science has gotten incredibly complex over its history. And there is no way for us to, quote, do our own scientific research on all these different topics. Scientists themselves can't do that. They're specialists in one topic. So then comes the issue of what we call epistemic trust, which is what you were just talking about. Who do we trust to have the right knowledge that's relevant to our concern? That's a challenge. But what you want to look for is expertise. So it's unlikely your Facebook friends, unless your Facebook friends are all infectious disease doctors, are the best source of information about infectious disease. It's just not likely. So looking for people with expertise, that's number one. And then number two, relevant expertise. That's very important. There's a lot of experts in, but a climate scientist is not the person you want to talk to about it. Vaccinations, that's they have expertise, but in the wrong area. So
Right.
relevant expertise, that's number one. Number two, you definitely want to check to see if this person has some other motivation for making their claims. Are they trying to sell you something? Are they spreading a political agenda? Like, there are reasons why someone who's even an expert in a field may not be trustworthy. We saw this in the United States, where during COVID, there was a big interest in ivermectin as a potential COVID treatment. And
Right.
some,
Ivermectin and uh, hydrochloroquine.
yeah, and some doctors,
Hydroxychloroquine, sorry.
yeah, some doctors came out in favor of it. And, so you can't look at just one doctor or two doctors, right? You have to look at what's the consensus view. And another example of that is the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel Report on Climate Change. You don't want to listen to just one person about climate who has a particular view. You want to look at what the expert consensus is. The IPCC report is the consensus document that says, what does all the science say? Not just this guy or that woman or that woman. What does all the science say? So you
Yeah.
look for you look for expertise,
Mhm.
relevant expertise, consensus, and then you look to see if someone has a motivation that would lead you astray.
All right, you had a fascinating bit about consensus in your book, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to quote you, but I'm going to paraphrase you. There was a situation where there was a topic, and then people were presented with the evidence that I think it was 93 experts agreed, like this is actually true. 93 relevant experts agreed that this was true and a good thing, and there were like four, I think, that were uncertain. So that brings us to 97. I think three disagreed. So like overwhelming consensus, 93 to 3, right? With a couple that weren't entirely sure. And when people were given that numerical data, they said, you know what? Okay, probably it's true. Like pretty much everybody who understands this stuff thinks it's true. That's where I'm going to place my belief. That's reasonable as far as it goes. But then you went further in your book, and people, or there was this experiment that went further, and they showed the numerical data, what I just said to you, and but then they gave, I think it was like a newspaper article. Correct me if I'm getting the details wrong, but it was like a newspaper article where they quoted one or two people in favor and one person against. So you got like one or two people in favor, so either equal time or a little bit still towards the positive. And even though people had the numerical data, if they read the article as well, they were far more likely to be uncertain or think that this topic was untrue. I found that mind boggling and was like, wow, how much of that has affected me over the years.
Well, this
And
is what we like to call balance as bias. So, in other
balance is
words,
bias. Okay, talk to me
balance
more
as
about that because I was really
bias.
interested.
So, people think it's fair to have one person on this side say what they believe and one person on this side to say what they believe because there's a balance there. But balance can be biased. If 97% of scientists believe that humans are impacting the climate and, 3% are skeptical of that, if you put them up against each other, that changes to 50-50. It looks like 50-50.
Right.
So you're misrepresenting the scientists' consensus view. So we
And I
call
don't
that.
think that any media article is going to publish the opinions of 97 scientists on one side in a single article.
Right, but what they should be doing is they should be giving the consensus view and giving people a sense of how much consensus there is. Because as
Right.
you pointed out earlier, sometimes there isn't consensus on a scientific issue. So we shouldn't be presenting two sides of every issue because science really isn't um, about who makes the best argument in a debate. That's not really how science is resolved.
Hmm.
Science controversial issues are resolved through evaluating evidence, and the overwhelming amount of evidence eventually leads to one conclusion versus another. And that's how these are resolved. They're not resolved by who makes the best debate on TV next to another person. That's not how it gets
I,
resolved.
I've I spent years throughout high school and university on the debating teams, and so I can say, as someone who is a fairly skilled debater, that it's a wonderful skill, but it is not a reliable method to get at truth.
And it's definitely not the way that science is resolved. Science
Hmm.
has to be resolved not by the strength of a rhetorical argument, but through the overwhelming evidence that leads to an undeniable conclusion. That is how it gets resolved, not through debate, not through rhetoric. And so this idea that balance can be biased really affects how we see science portrayed, particularly through journalism, where they feel very compelled to present the other side. So it's like you really shouldn't put a person who's a flat earther up against, Neil deGrasse Tyson and talk about whether the earth is round or flat. I mean, that's just not a productive way to portray science at all.
Right. All right. I'm going to jump back to what our initial conversation. You mentioned that there are emotions, there are cognitive biases, and I'm going to bring it back to motivated reasoning. Now, at least on the surface level, motivated reasoning and emotions seem to be the same thing. I want something to be true, so I'm going to go for that. That seems that's an emotional response. So, what is motivated reasoning? Why? How does it lead us astray, and how is that different from how emotions facilitate or inhibit our understanding?
Motivated reasoning is when someone is reasoning towards a desired conclusion rather than an accurate one. And this can seem very unemotional. People are incredibly good, for example, at picking apart the flaws in a research study when that research study's conclusion doesn't fit their pre existing point of view. So they're very good at saying, well, the sample size was a little small. They didn't carefully replicate. They all of a sudden become very, very good at evaluating the scientific evidence, and they're very picky about it when the conclusions don't support where they had originally believed. So that's motivated reasoning, when we are reasoning towards a desired conclusion and not towards an accurate one. And people can be incredibly rational about that and believe very, very strongly that they are being very scientific in their evaluation and they're being very rational. And
Is
often they are trying to be, but
Mhm.
our motivations can sometimes steer us in the wrong direction.
And is the flip side true? If a study's conclusion is consistent with what I want it to be or with what I already believe, um, that my standards
Yeah, you
would
think it's
I
true.
wouldn't be nearly as picky,
Yeah,
right? Maybe you know what, so maybe the sample size wasn't so great, it wasn't so large, but the conclusion is so obviously accurate that I'm going to let it
or
pass and
maybe
say that
it's
this is
just
a good study.
or maybe it's just that you want it to be. Barbara and I love to talk about this one study that showed eating chocolate for breakfast helps postmenopausal women lose weight. And we were like, yeah, that sounds great. I love this study. but But of course, if you just step back, like we said, take a minute and look at it, it had a very low sample size. It wasn't replicated. And we had to give up our desire to want to believe this finding because it really wasn't a significant study. So, yes, it happens on the other side too. You're very quick to believe what you want to believe, and you're very much more critical of research studies that don't support what you previously believed. And again,
Yeah,
what's
I
important
remember
about
reading
this,
about a study that said that like both red wine and chocolate, or sorry, two different studies. One that said red wine was good for your health, your heart, and another that said chocolate was good for your health. I was like, I don't care about the methodology. These studies are obviously true,
these
and I think
studies
that's
are
like
obviously true. We
it's like
obviously want
sorry, I bought a bottle of red wine. Like this is for my health. I don't actually want it, but I want to live a long time. I want to be healthy, so I need more chocolate in my diet. I think I think that you might be onto something there. I might be guilty of motivated reasoning here.
well, I think that's an important point that I really want to emphasize is that we are all guilty of motivated reasoning. We are all
Hmm.
guilty of letting our emotions overcome us, and not stepping back and evaluating evidence. We're all of these things we're talking about. We're all guilty of it. It
Yeah, I
isn't
mean,
the
I
case.
didn't actually adjust my life according to those studies, but I also didn't look into, I didn't actually look into them to find out if they were, how well they were conducted because I didn't want to burst that little bubble. So no,
Exactly,
that's
exactly.
a good point.
Well, what's important is that I often get asked by people like, "Who are these science deniers? Who are these weirdos?" It's like, "Oh no, 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 no. There's not a group of people who are science deniers, and then the rest of us are not succumb to these challenges of understanding and accepting science. That's not the way that works. We all have these cognitive biases. We can all be motivated in our reasoning. We can all have our emotions overcome our rationality. So it isn't the case that there's an us and them. We all can do this, and that's also a good point because it means we can all be more thoughtful about it, and we
Right.
can
And
all.
you say that right at the beginning of your book. Early in your introduction, you write, uh, no one demographic or political group has a corner on science doubt or denial. Science misunderstanding is evident across racial, gender, age, and political lines. And I think that that's actually really important that, it really isn't an us versus them. There's just an us.
There's just an us, and the reason why it goes back to our very original conversation is we're all humans, and we all
Right.
have these propensities to think in different ways, and it doesn't really cut it across particular groups. So I mean, I think one difference that we can all strive for is a willingness to step back and be reflective. That's something we can all strive for. We can all say, well, was that red wine study really good study? Was it
I'm
really
gonna
good?
have to look that up now, Gail. That makes me very sad. All right, red wine and chocolate notwithstanding, I want to come back to identities and how identities can uh, help or inhibit a scientific understanding. And when I hear the word identities, there are two factors that come immediately to mind, and I want you to tell me whether I'm right and whether I need to expand that. What immediately comes to mind is religion. I'm a Christian, Hindu, non-believer, Muslim, whatever, and politics. I affiliate with a particular political philosophy and or a particular political party. There's partisanship in there, or political ideology that acts as a filter through which people view things. So when you say that identity can be an inhibitor or can lead to science denial or science doubt or misunderstanding, is that what you mean? And can you expand on that a little bit further, please?
Absolutely. Our religious affiliation or our political affiliation is part of our identity, but it can be anything else too. For
Okay,
example, eh,
expand my horizons here.
so Southern California liberal moms are often anti vax, for example. It really depends on what that identity is for you in terms of what's salient. Maybe it's that you're a mom and you eat organic. So it doesn't necessarily mean a particular political affiliation or religious affiliation, although it certainly can, but it's
Okay,
who is your in group, we call it in psychology. Who's your in group? Who are your people? Who is it that you hang out with, trust? And the reason why this is so powerful is back to our evolution conversation. The absolute worst thing that can happen to you as in our evolutionary history was being kicked out of the group. You would
okay.
simply die. You cannot survive on your own as a human without some interaction with other people to support you, to look out for you, to have your back, as it were. And
Exile is a
so,
death sentence.
yeah, exile is a death sentence. And so you have a very, very deep seated desire to not get kicked out of your group. So if you're at a party and everybody at that party is expressing a particular point of view and you really want to be at this party, you like these people, you're having fun, and they turn to you and they say, "What do you think?" You're like, "Well, sure." You might go along because you would rather just go along than be kicked out of the group. And so our identity group, whatever it is, it doesn't have to be religious or political, but it certainly can be. Our identity group is the group that we want to hang with and we don't want to be ostracized from. So when they express views about science, we tend to go along with those views rather than risk being outed of the group.
Okay, so essentially, this is the adult version of succumbing to peer pressure.
Well,
No? Okay.
no, because the peers aren't pressuring you to do it, you are doing it.
Oh,
So
it's an internally generated thing, not a
yeah,
caving
yeah,
into.
they're not. I mean, you can be pressured by your in group to believe something, but that's not generally how it works. Generally, how it works is you go along to get along. I'm sure you've heard that
Okay,
expression.
I
You go
certainly have.
along
Yeah.
to get along, and it isn't necessarily the case they're pressuring you to go along. You choose to so that you can stay in the group. Now, that said, do some groups pressure people to believe something? Sure, but most commonly, you just go along because you want to be part of the group. And I have had Southern California moms tell me, I can't tell the other moms in my child's play group that I got her vaccinated because she'll get kicked out of the group. I've had people
Wow.
tell me that. So
Wow. Like
you
it's
just,
so important to this community
that's
that
this, their
none of the
child's
kids can be
friends, their
vaccinated,
child's
that you
friends,
will be
they
banished.
love this group, they love these friends they're
Yeah.
playing with, they don't want to get kicked out. And
Wow.
that's really the more common. So that doesn't even have to be about religion or about politics, but obviously it's any group, any group that
Okay.
you identify with and that is important to you.
So we've spent pretty much all of our time so far talking about how and why our faulty brains can lead people, otherwise intelligent, educated people, to deny something known to be false, or something deny something known to be true about the world we live in. I'd like to spend the rest of our time about how we can foster an accurate understanding of the world, which again, to my mind, is a pro-scientific worldview. And I want to start with a line. I think you were quoting somebody else here, and this really jumped out at me. You wrote, or you quoted, a scientific attitude is a commitment to two principles: caring about empirical evidence and a willingness to change theories in light of new evidence. And I thought that was a great synopsis. And I'd like to ask you how we, and by we, I mean people like me, our listeners who are not necessarily scientists, I'm certainly not, but I'm very interested in maintaining a scientific literacy, and how we can um, how we can increase our commitment to these two principles.
So I'd like to credit Lee McIntyre, who has written that book called Scientific Attitude. And those two principles are the principles that my co-author Barbara Hofer and I think are the most important. Like, people always say, "Oh, you just accept science." It's like, no, that's not what we're advocating, because of course science changes all the time. No, we advocate adopting a scientific attitude. So, what does that mean? It means that you are open to evidence, you're willing to evaluate that evidence. And most importantly, you're willing to change your mind in light of new evidence, because that's really how science works. So, famously in the US, and I don't know how much this happened in Canada, but in the US at the beginning of the coronavirus, um, there wasn't a real emphasis on mask wearing because it was not well understood that it was transmitted um, through the air. And then when that was discovered, then of course mask wearing was suggested, and in some places required, and people lost their minds. People were in the United States were like, the scientists lied to us. That's not what happened at all. What happened was the typical course of science, where in a novel coronavirus novel, it was new, they had an initial hypothesis, turned out to be wrong. They changed their minds in light of that new evidence, ergo they changed their recommendation. That's exactly how you want science to work, and that's exactly how you want to think and reason in your own life. And it can be helpful, as you say, it doesn't have to be for science. How where'd you lose your keys? why why isn't the remote on my television wasn't working the other day, and I thought it was batteries. Then the batteries weren't it, and then I gave it to my husband. I said, you have to test some ideas. We couldn't figure out what it was, so we had to go through methodologically and try different things to see why the remote wasn't working. So in your own life, as you try to problem solve, think, and reason about very dire situations and consequences, like should I take a particular medical treatment for my disease, or should I get vaccinated, all to how do I fix the remote, and everything in between, you can use these principles of scientific reasoning where you're open minded, you're evaluating evidence, and you're changing your mind in light of new evidence. And that can help you in your everyday life.
Yeah, that reminds me of a famous quotation, and because it's so famous, it's probably apocryphal. But I'm going of a economist, John Maynard Keynes, who is said to have said, "When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir?" And I think that's appropriate to hear. Uh, at the end of your book, you write, and this is another thing that where the words just sort of jumped off the page to me. Too often in the past, science was taught as a collection of facts to be mastered. Today, educators are encouraged to teach fewer facts and more process. And that the reason that jumped off the page to me is because that really resonated. I went to high school a few decades ago, and so I took science. I took grade 9 and 10 science, and then 11 and grades 11 and 12. I took physics and chemistry. I took like physics 101, biology 101 in university. Science wasn't my major, but they were just optional courses that I took. And it really was, look, these are the laws of physics. Here are the different types of bondings that atoms can do to other atoms to form molecules, which do these things. These are the names of the bodies, and this is how cells divide. And it was really, I had to understand the concepts. It wasn't strictly memorization. The concepts were connected. There was genuine understanding there, but it really was just a here's what we know, and we are transmitting that knowledge to you. And it was a set of facts, and it was true, right? To the best of our understanding, this was the current state of physics, chemistry, biology at the introductory levels, which was pretty well established. But what I didn't learn in my high school and non-major, first year university courses in scientific disciplines was the whole the scientific method, right? Have a hypothesis, test it, and then everybody else is going to do everything they can to demolish your idea. That's their job, basically. And if the idea still stands despite their best efforts, okay, maybe there's something to it. Well, like, I only came to that much later in life. Um, so when I read that line, I tried to envision what my high school chemistry or physics class would have been like, and I kind of failed because it was be so different. So can you tell us how we can teach science to favor process, or at least include it in a meaningful way over just these are the discoveries that you need to understand?
Oh, absolutely. So, same as you, when I was in high school, science was what was in the textbook. It was what was in the science textbook, and
Yeah,
your job was just to learn that. And you didn't get taught how science comes to know what they know. That's really the important thing for us to understand is how do science know what they know, and how and why don't they know certain things? What are aspects of science that they don't know, and why? So it's all that how the scientific process works. And yes, it's partly the scientific method, but that's only experimental. There's so many other aspects of science besides experimental. You can't do experiments on um, astronomy in terms of, there's really mostly observational as opposed to experimental. So it's not simply just a hypothesis testing scientific method that
right.
we learned as well. There's many other ways to do science that aren't experimental, for example, observational. So we need to
Right.
teach.
Theoretical physics, archaeology. We're not running experiments in
You're not
either of
running
those.
experiments, right?
Right.
You're discovering fossils and then determining their age, for example.
Yeah.
So yes,
Paleontology. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
So it's not just a bunch of facts, and it's definitely not one method. And the way that we are encouraging teachers to teach science now is to engage students in that process. So, really great science teachers let kids ask questions of their own interest and then let them investigate and figure out how to answer those questions. And these can be incredibly fun projects. We've done with fourth graders. We brought Mattel Hot Wheels cars and tracks into a classroom and asked kids, "What do you want to test?" "Oh, I want to test if this car goes faster if I tape a penny on top of it than if I don't." Great, let's test it. How would we test that? So we had kids test all these ideas about force and motion, their own ideas, and we helped them figure out how to test them. And kids love this kind of science where they get to engage in inquiry about their own questions of interest. And that's how you teach about process. You let them engage in it.
Okay. I have two reactions to that. One is that sounds awesome.
It
And
was
two,
awesome.
but two, that means that every classroom is going to be different. And like if one thing has been kind of almost drilled into me, and seems to be even more so now than it was when I was in high school, is that we need to have standards, we need to have commonality, we need to have a test, and we need to make sure that an 87% in this school is the same as an 87% in that school. And how would we ensure that they that the curriculum is being taught if every classroom is completely different? Or how can we get our educational institutions to accept that level of diversity in methods and subjects across various classrooms?
So it's definitely not about throwing out standards. It's definitely not about every day is wildly different from every other day. It's about integrating into our curricular objectives opportunities as often as possible for kids to ask their own questions and answer them. And that you do learn, so this unit we did force in motion, those are curricular standards. This was called speedometry. People can look it up. And in answer to your question, on our speedometry website, we list the standards that you are meeting through this exercise. So it isn't an either or. It's not about doing your own inquiry work or mastering standards. It's about mastering standards through doing your own inquiry work.
All right. I have about 10 more things that I want to ask you, but I'm going to limit it to one because we've been talking for a while now. And again, this is another thing that just jumped off the page, and I'll kick myself if I don't bring it up. And you brought up three mindsets of how people can like view the world or come to understand the world, and you named them. And one was absolutism, thinking in absolute terms, multiplism, which is a new word for me and sounds like something that it isn't, but multiplism, which is entertaining multiple points of view as equally valid. And then evaluativism. I just realized I've read it but haven't actually said it out loud before. Evaluativism, which is evaluating and seeking to substantiate one's views. So I'd like you to please talk about those three views in a bit more detail, and how a person can recognize how they view the world and where they might want to move to if they want to have a more robust scientific understanding of the universe.
Yeah, those terms are a mouthful. And Barbara, my co author's expertise is in the development of epistemic cognition. So that's what you just described, the development of epistemic cognition. What's epistemic cognition? It's how we think about thinking. How do we think
Okay.
about thinking? How do we think about knowledge? How do we think about how one acquires knowledge? So that's called epistemic cognition. It's my co author's main area of expertise and research. And what she describes is that developmental trajectory, so that you talked about. So, originally kids are very black and white in their view of things. Things are right and wrong, very black and white. That's that objectivism stage you talked about. And then somewhere around middle school and the teenage years, they become multiplists or relativists, even, where there's all sorts of points of view. How could we possibly adjudicate that? So everybody's point of view is equally as good as everybody else's. If you think the earth is flat, that's great. That's your point of view. We can't evaluate it, so who knows? And then a more developmentally mature, according to psychologists, way of thinking about knowledge and knowing is evaluativism, where you say, well, wait a minute, here's two contradictory points of view. How can we evaluate whether one has more evidence than the other, whether one is more accurate, whether one is more truthful? And in fact, you can do that with science. It's, I will admit, more difficult with other areas as you get into philosophical or religious or other areas where you're debating how's the best way to be a human or something like that. Back to your debate team in high school.
Right.
But in science, the earth is definitely spherical, and we know that. And so if you have two points of view, the earth is spherical, the earth is flat, that is something we can adjudicate. So it isn't that all points of view of science are equally valid. That isn't the case in science. In much of science, I will say there's a lot of science still to be discovered, and there's still a lot of science on the edges that may not be that clear, and that's fine. But for those that are clear, you can evaluate those two points of view. And when you get to that point developmentally, that last stage, evaluativism, that's where you recognize that two points of view can differ and can be evaluated, and perhaps one is more correct than the other.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Gale. This has been a great conversation. We've covered maybe 10% of what's in your book, science denial, why it happens, and what to do about it. So if you've enjoyed this conversation, please take the book, read it. There's so much more content in there, but I want this to be a conversation of reasonable length. Uh, Gale, do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to impart upon our audience?
No, I just want to say that if you're interested in the book, it is really reasonably priced. There's a 2021 hardcover edition that's like, you can find it for about $12 on Amazon. We have a website called sciencedenialbook.com. And on that website, you can find all sorts of articles we've written and other podcasts we've done. And all of that is freely available to you. So it's sciencedenialbook.com. You can go there and get a lot of free
And I'll
information.
I'll put that link in the show notes.
And we have a 2023 version of the book, which is paperback and has an additional chapter.
Wonderful. All right. Well, Gale Sinatra, thank you so much for speaking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a delightful conversation. Appreciate your time.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please show your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry and give us a 5-star review. Email us at podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web, centerforinquiry.ca. We are on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter or X at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Zach Dumont and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood. See you next time.